Okay, I'm going to talk about Napoleon today. It was about, maybe 10 years ago during the French Open, before the French Open, the tennis tournament that BNP puts on every late spring. They took one of the American players, a female player, on a quick limousine tour of Paris of a full day. And at the end, someone asked her, French host asked, well, what did you like best about the tour of Paris? And she said, the best thing was the tomb of the little dead dude. I couldn't make that up. And Napoleon continues to fascinate, though not necessarily me. The coverage in what you're reading is straightforward. So today I'm going to talk about a couple themes. First of all, what was Corsican, what remained Corsican about Napoleon, and then maybe discuss a question raised by David Bell of late. Was the Revolutionary period, and particularly Napoleon, the first total war, in the sense that 20th century folks, and at least you were born in the 20th century, have come to understand. And in the end, just not ramble a bit, but just talk about what the most important contributions of Napoleon, what they were. Somebody counted up, not me, that by 1980 there had been at least 220,000 books and articles published on Napoleon in a variety of languages. Three recent books, which just if you're Napoleon buffs or simply want to read about him, that are quite good in English are my old friend Stephen England's book, Napoleon, A Political History, which came out 3 or 4 years ago and was recently translated into French. Philip Dwyer's book on Napoleon up to 1799. Philip Dwyer hates Napoleon, but it's a pretty interesting look at the early career. And finally, I suppose most controversially, David Bell's book, The First Total War, which I'll discuss some of the themes in a while. It was only about 6 or 7 years ago, I remember this, that they discovered in Lithuania a whole bunch of bones, of dead bones. Well, bones are dead, I guess. I mean, if they've been there for 200 years or whatever. But not a grave site, because they were never properly buried, but a place where expired in the snows of 1812 a good number of soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée, the big army. And so, I mean, 1812 still goes on. There is a book, also interesting book, if you're looking for paper topics, that I sometimes assign in the French course, called Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. And by the time of 1812, the majority of the Grande Armée were really people who had been conscripted or impounded, if you will, in various allied states. But it's a quite interesting account of what it was like in Napoleon's armies as he invaded further and further into Eastern Europe. By the way, among the, I just did a subject search on Napoleon once. I don't know why, but of the 220,000 books, you probably will want to not read the tantalizing 1894 classic Napoleon and the Fair Sex, or Napoleon and His Women Friends, which was from 1927, Napoleon in Love, I mean there are lots of those, 1959, and Napoleon Seen by a Canadian, published in 1937. So, I talk a lot about Napoleon's life in the textbook, but let's look at the theme of Napoleon and Corsica. I once took a whole flock of Yale alumni to see Napoleon's house in Ajaccio, where he was born on the 15th of August. He wrote in a letter to the Corsican patriot with whom he subsequently broke, Paoli, he wrote on the 12th of June, 1789, "I was born when the French were vomited upon our coasts," that is the coast of Corsica, "drowning the throne of liberty in torrents of blood. Such was the odious spectacle that first met my eyes. The cries of the dying, the groans of the oppressed, tears of despair surrounded my cradle at my birth." Corsica, as I'm sure you know, is an island, a big island. It's north of Sardinia, which belongs to Italy. He at first gloried in his Corsican origins, hating the French who had conquered his island. Of course, the French Revolution would change all that, and that's why it's a good idea to look at him as you look at Robespierre and others and see what difference the French Revolution made. Between 1785, and here I'm drawing on Dwyer, and 1795, that is between ages 16 and 26, he wrote a number of notes and sketches and short stories that reveal much about his attachment to Corsica, but also that suggest the dramatic nature of the change as he embraces the revolution and France. Now, he spoke Corsican and not French. I mean, so French was his second language, and Corsican is a it's a language. It's a patois that is more closely tied to a patois or dialect of northern Italy. In fact, when you drive around Corsica, most of the radio stations that you can get are Italian and not French. He learned French and he made errors. Even at the end of his life, he made errors in French. So he wrote French very well. So he was bilingual, but he never lost his accent. And one of the things about northern French people in particular is that they're less likely to forgive southern accents. And of course, one of the stereotypes of Corsicans is they all become policemen in Paris. And many of them have I's at the end of their name. And they have a very strong a southern French accent that is, it's not really a Toulouse accent or our part of France, an Ardèche accent, where you can always tell, if those of you know French, and again, if you don't know French, it doesn't make a slight bit of difference, but somebody who says 80 instead of 80, or Cassang instead of the great human rights advocate René Cassin, c'est Cassang, or vin. Moi, je prends un verre de vin, a glass of wine instead of vin. So Corsica, I mean, it's a famous story about Napoleon when he goes off to military school as a very young boy, that they made fun of his accent. And well, more about that in a while. But anyway, at the beginning, he hated the French and espoused the fact that he was a Corsican. He felt culturally marginal, and this was compounded by his personal loneliness. When he was assigned to Valence, which could make anyone sort of mildly depressed, Valence on the Rhone River, he contemplated suicide quite seriously. He spent a lot of time sort of reading and just sort of hanging out by himself, and through much of his early days lacked friends. In 1768, Corsica, which had been part of the Republic of Genoa, that is the port city of Genoa, just en face, I mean really across the sea, gave up Corsica to France, or really sold it. The French state actively worked to try to create a loyal Corsican nobility, and thus the family of Napoleon, the Bonapartes, B-O-N-A-P-A-R-T-E-S, who had a U that he subsequently took out of his name, in the first four letters, were ennobled in 1771 by the French. But, I mean, all nobles aren't rich, as you know. And so he was sort of what you'd call in French an aubereau, sort of a poor noble. Four of Carlo, that is his dad, Bonaparte's 8 children, received scholarships to study in France, including Napoleon, who was sent to a place called Brienne, it doesn't matter, in the north of France. 50 of the 110 students in this school were called royal scholars. So here again, here's kind of a comparison to that case of downward mobility, Robespierre, who was also a scholarship guy. And there was nothing wrong with that at all, except that there were a lot of fancy noble offspring there too, who had another reason to mock Napoleon. And so he wrote in Valence, when he was posted to Valence, again on the Rhone River, about an hour now by car south of Lyon. He wrote that life was a burden because there is no pleasure. It is nothing but pain. It is a burden because the men and women with whom I live, and probably will always have to live, have customs that are as far from mine as the light of the moon is different from the light of the sun. But yet there was French influence in his life. He read the philosophes. He read Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and in 1791, again, I don't want to push this comparison because he was different in many ways than Robespierre, but like Robespierre, he enters an essay contest sponsored by an academy, in this case, the Academy of Lyon. But his writings mostly reflect an obsession with his origins. I haven't read a lot of his early writings, but Philip Dwyer has. One of his colleagues in school drew a cartoon of Napoleon rushing to Corsica to aid the Corsican rebel Paoli, and he must have discussed this with his friends. And he also battled with those as he saw as his rivals. A long time ago, in the 1920s, I guess it was, the producer Abel Gance produced this 3.5-hour film, which actually is extremely boring, called Napoleon, without sound. But the most famous scene in it, arguably, is the snowball fight, where Napoleon takes a snowball fight to a more serious dimension and tries out tactics and all of this, but in a way, is fighting for his independence and the status as a non-French Corsican, but who been washed up on the shores of France by a fortune, good or bad. And at that point, he wasn't really too sure what it was. He began to write a history of Corsica, less than 100 pages, which he thought took seriously enough to begin to revise in the early 1790s, after the French Revolution. And in it, according to Philip Dwyer, he portrays Corsicans as courageous, even heroic, in throwing off the rule of Genoa and battling the French. For over 24 centuries, he wrote, the same scenes have been repeated without interruption. The same vicissitudes, the same misfortunes, but also the same courage, the same resolution, the same audacity. But his letters and his writings reveal the folks that he was reading. That is the influence of the philosophe, portraying Corsica seeking liberty in the shadow of oppression, in opposition to royal authority. So he links kind of the themes of the philosophe in defense of Corsica's fight for freedom. So even in the 1790s, if this interpretation is correct, he did not see his identity as both Corsican and French, but rather as Corsican. But by 1799, when he, with the help of the wily Abbé Sieyès, comes to power on the 18th of Brumaire, the French identity had overwhelmed his Corsican identity. So the question is, did he merely catch the nearest way? Is it opportunism? Or was it his belief that the French Revolution in La Belle France offered a liberating possibilities for humanities? In a short story that he wrote in the summer of 1789, a rather important summer, the French were portrayed as tyrants still in his story called the Nouvelle Corse, or the New Corsica. And he used violence, and his life would be one characterized by violence, as a way of increasing sympathy for the Corsican people. Also as a cultural expression of Corsican vengeance. Corsica, because of, this isn't just a stereotype, but because of the sort of flashing knives of clan and family rivalries, there were so many crimes in Corsica in the 19th century that the island of Corsica, which became a département, now it's two, but one of the departments of France, had to be excluded when somebody was doing a study of crime. Because there's so many more crimes in Corsica. In fact, still the tradition of flashing knives and you know, the Corsican independence movement still places bombs sometimes and blows up. There are various independence movements, but blows up a lotissement or you know, a housing development being built for you know, Parisian or Marseille lawyers or something like that, and there still are these kinds of resentments. So in the beginning, he still identified with Paoli, but he would break with Paoli. Paoli, the Corsican patriot, was sort of seen as the George Washington of his island. And Napoleon was constructing a vision of what he thought he could become, that is to help liberate Corsica from French rule. How ironic. His father, Carlo, had in his own view, that is Napoleon's view, betrayed the Corsican cause by going over to the French. And so in a way, I mean, you could argue that he's rebelling against his father, at least in the early stages. But the revolution did bring a change, obviously. It transformed the relations between France and Corsica. In 1789, there were 4 deputies elected to the Estates General, and in 1790, Corsica is recognized as a département, as a department. Corsicans demanded a royal decree that would recognize the island as an integral part of France, subject to the laws of France, and declared that those who had fought against France ought to be permitted to return to their homeland. On the 27th of December, there were celebrations in all Corsican churches, and Napoleon had a banner hung in his not inconsiderable house in Ajaccio, the family house, "Vive la nation, vive Paoli, vive Mirabeau," who had supported the decree. Long live the nation, long live Paoli, long live Mirabeau. He's trying to play it both ways. He wrote, "From now on, we, that is Corsica and France, have the same interests, the same concerns. The sea no longer separates us." Indeed, I mean, that's hardly the case, because even today, Corsica, there have to be subventions to help keep the cost of food down in Corsica because of the enormous cost of transporting things that are not produced locally. I mean, you can't just live on goat's cheese and things like that, and wine, red wine produced in Corsica. So, I mean, the sea does matter, all that. But the revolution helped Napoleon reconcile some of the contradictions that had bothered him all the way along. So at this point, he'd become a French Corsican. He renounced publishing some of his letters and began to enter these political struggles in the revolution. And indeed, he was lucky. I mean, one of the amazing things about Napoleon was his luck, because when he might have well been guillotined as being a Jacobin, he was in Corsica or in the south of France. He was always seemed to be in the right place, and this was true in his battles as well. He was a tremendously courageous guy, and the guards are always his bodyguards are always trying to get him to move back in the traditional way as an officer or commander, which he was the commander from the battles, and he in fact is only wounded very lightly 2 or 3 times. So he's pretty lucky that when bodies are falling and horses are falling all around him. I mean, he remained an extremely lucky guy, and this also accounts for his success. Though even for the 18th Brumaire, I mean, in 1799, clearly it would be a military person who is going to put an end to what has been indelicately called the War of the Chamber Pots. That was the Directory, that is the period of the post-Thermidor. The Directory, and the battles between left and right, and the revolution made military men extraordinarily important. I mean, there wasn't a king anymore, and the War of the Chamber Pots and the sort of sleaziness of the period, though it was important in giving France some sort of parliamentary experience in a meaningful way, meant that some military person was going to be imposing order in quotes. When Abbé Sieyès, who had survived, he of what is the Third Estate, who had also survived all of the vicissitudes of the revolution, when he thinks about one general, another military man says, "There's your man, there's Napoleon, who is again in the right place. He's going to do a better coup d'etat than the other guy could have done." And so Napoleon there happened to be a lucky fellow as well. In 1793, the followers of Paoli broke with the convention during the Federalist revolts, which you know about, and during the expulsion of the Girondins from the convention. And then the uprisings come in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, Toulon, etc., etc. And those on the outs with Paoli, including Napoleon, now embrace the Jacobin cause. The Corsican Assembly in Ajaccio, by the way, it's Ajaccio, A-J-A-C-C-I-O, Ajaccio, they condemned the Bonapartes, who had dropped the U in their name, by the way, that's in the book, as having been born in the mud of despotism. And so Napoleon turned his back on the independence movement to which he had pledged in the privacy of his room in Valence and other places, in Brienne, a fidelity, and he now hated Paoli, for whom he blamed for having turned so many Corsicans against France. Again, is this opportunism? Had he merely caught the nearest way? But he had embraced the national identity of being French, and he did take ideas seriously. It's possible to argue, I would believe this, that the philosophes eventually won out, and he saw the revolution as a liberating experience for France and the construction of a new way of imagining the state. Of course, he turns that into out-and-out political repression in his own country and the conquest, the megalomaniac. What is the answer of that? I can't even think of it. Conquest of all of these other places. And when he married, Josephine, who once somebody said would have drunk gold out of the skull of any of her lovers, he made sure that the French spelling on the marriage certificate was there, and that the U, the Corsican U, had been taken out of his name. On the island of St. Helena, in the middle of nowhere, where he had a lot of time to think, he wrote, "I am more Champenois," that was Champagne, where the town of Brienne was, his military school, Reims, Epernay, Champagne, and all these good things. "I am more Champenois than Corsican, because from the age of 9, I was raised in Brienne. It would have displeased the French if I'd surrounded myself with Corsicans. On the contrary, I wanted absolutely to be French. Of all the insults I have had heaped upon me in so many pamphlets, the one to which I was most sensitive was that of being Corsican." Now, Napoleon was an inveterate liar, particularly when he was trying to craft, was quite clear, he was already ill, his legacy. And much of what he wrote on the island, talking about his eternal devotion to the principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality, was trying to plan these 220,000 articles and books that would be written about him until 1980. And this was a sheer invention of the past, because the record is quite clear in his writings and what he said, that he considered himself Corsican. But yet, the Frenchness of the revolution overwhelmed that in him, and in the end he remained a Frenchman, like very many people, with a strong accent, and in his case that of Corsica. Now, there were some other obvious things that are Corsican about him that remained, and again, this is part of the stereotype. In France, like other countries, one has stereotypes about different regions. In France, people think, for example, that those from the center of France, from Auvergne, are cheap, radin in France, that they're cheap. or that people in Marseille exaggerate. If you say somebody in French, you're from Marseille, aren't you? After they just said that they caught a 1,000-pound perch or something like that, or the Marseille had just scored the goal of the century. I mean, there's a tendency of people from Marseille to exaggerate, and these sort of regional stereotypes are part of any country. So one of the stereotypes, so there's something to do this. Truth with this is the idea of family loyalty. I mean, most people are loyal to their families, but Napoleon took the kind of clan identity a bit strong, and of course what he does is he perches his various brothers on the thrones of almost everywhere, this kind of family loyalty. But it's not just people from Corsica who might, given that situation, do the same thing. But also there's the settling of scores, and Napoleon, I'll talk about this in a while. If you do believe that the period is, we can see the origins of total war there. I'm a little skeptical about this. Nonetheless, when people turned against Napoleon or against the French armies, his reaction was, we're going to pay them back, and we're going to get them. Not with flashing knives, but with executions, burning of villages in Palestine, more about this later, in the south of Italy, and in the Tyrol, in the mountains of Austria. And whether vengeance is more of a Corsican thing than a Champenois thing, or a Lyonnais thing, or a Breton thing, or a North German thing, or a Polish thing, or whatever, one can't say. But yet, lots of the thinking about Napoleon looks for things that remain Corsican about him. Now, having said all of that, what should we do? Let's now turn to this question of whether we think, and it's just a rhetorical question, whether my dear friend David Bell is right that you can see the origins of total war in this period. One thing I'm a little skeptical about is that if you compare this to the 30 Years' War, and you saw those ghoulish illustrations before of different ways you could perish at the hands of enemies determined for no particular reason, in many cases, to simply destroy you. It's not clear that the Revolutionary period and the Napoleonic Wars really it was the first. But yet, if we think aloud, and that's what I'm doing, if we see the origins of total war in World War I, where the mobilization of state resources as much as possible to the war, and again in World War II, and particularly in World War II, the breaking down of the differentiation between civilians and non-civilians. That happens a little bit in 1914, but not that much. It happens in the massacre, the Turkish massacres of the Armenians in 1895 and 1915. That happens too. But it is possible to argue that the revolutionary, and particularly the Napoleonic period, from that point of view, the mobilization of burning down, melting church bells, and transforming almost every available industrial site into war production, and turning out all these cannonballs and all these rifles and all these swords and all these bayonets with the total resources of the state directed toward war. That, I mean, there is a point there. So there's really two sides of that argument. That's one. The mobilization of resources, the levée en masse, a mass military conscription, that all citizens, male citizens, are going to be part are going to be in the army. This starts with the French Revolution. After all, Valmy was the battle near the windmill near Châlons en Champagne in the east of France. The sans-culottes going to war was the levée en masse, where ordinary people are full of enthusiasm and singing patriotic songs, or heading off to fight the enemy. But the other side of this total war story is, of course, what happens to the civilian population. And Napoleon once said in one of his rare moments of real introspection, that he didn't give a damn if a million men or a million people died because of him. He believed, I mean, part of his great failing, his great weakness and the suffering of humanity because of it was his his sense that no matter what he did, it was the right thing to do. He has this sort of hallucination moment in about 1896 after one of his battles. I think it's Arcole, where he sees after himself, he sees himself transported in air, and that the whole world seemed to be like you're taking off in an airplane. The whole world is beneath him, and at that point he has this sort of sense that what he would will as a human being would inevitably become reality because he willed it. And the other half of this sort of total war aspect is that, to be sure, not only did something like one of every French males born who would have been eligible for military service die during the Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, but the sort of meting out of a brutal vengeance, more than just in a Corsican sense, to people who crossed his will, does anticipate in some ways, if you will, and I'm not even sure how much I believe this, but the 20th century. Because on one hand, as the difference between soldiers and civilians are being eliminated with the sort of the end of the really just professional army of the 18th century. It's possible to get a lot of people killed in the 18th century too, in those professional army wars and all that business. But victims too are not just military people. And of course, the worst atrocities committed by French troops were in this sort of madcap Egyptian Middle Eastern adventure when he goes off with a boat packed with scientists as well as munitions and lots to eat, and goes off to Egypt and imagines conquering India. I mean, and he had an idea how far India was away. And of course, when people don't put up with this, then he massacres them in Palestine. They raise villages, and that's the end of that. And as I said before, the examples before would be in Calabria, in the south of Italy, when there's persistent sort of rebellions, resistance to French rule. And why not? Then they just start massacring people. And of course, the famous case of Spain, where you have that are forever on these magnificent canvases of Goya, where French troops are shooting down Spanish peasants who are resisting in the Peninsular War. These two, I guess by more modern definitions, not contemporary ones necessarily from that period, but would be classified as massacres. So it's possible, this isn't too far-fetched to imagine the sort of total war as being part of that experience. And it was from 1792 to 1815, the experience of ordinary people in much of Europe was war. There is there is that too, and in Napoleon's reaction to all of that was, I mean, je m'en fous. I mean, he didn't really care, and after every big defeat, the next step was to plan the next war. And the most famous example, of course, is when you've got hundreds of thousands of people that are picked off by Russian partisans, and why not, or freeze to death in the Russian winter. And when Napoleon, with this sort of ragtag band of survivors, when they get back to France, one can see why that French expression "to lie like a military bulletin" comes into existence, because the military bulletin that church people had to read, that priests had to read in at Mass, said that the emperor's health had never been better. And of course, that was true enough. And he immediately begins to start planning another war. And of course, when Cossacks are camped on Montmartre, and indeed start the first Russian restaurant in Paris in 1814, and he's packed off to the island of Elba, not too far from the Italian coast, and he makes his 100 days escape and lands at Fréjus in the south of France. And Marshal Ney famously throws himself into his arms after having been sent to arrest him. Napoleon is immediately planning the next war, and then that ends happily for the rest of Europe at Waterloo, when Napoleon typically does not designate or delegate enough authority, and Marshal Grouchy does not come to rescue him, and he's rounded up and sent so far away. It's a little different difficulty to plan a next European war if the closest port is some 600 miles away and it's in Peru or someplace like that. So I made this part of what I'm saying today in kind of a rhetorical way. I'm posing a question, because I don't really have a good answer to that. But I don't believe that history runs on railroad tracks, and all you need is the timetable to see when modern times show up. But if you look at the horrors of the 20th century, and the butchery of civilians, 1895, the Armenian massacre, or the butchery of civilians after the Paris Commune of 1871, it's not too hard to see all of this. We're not yet talking about the Holocaust. We're not talking about World War II. But yet some of that was out there, and that again, one more point too is that, I mean, I'm obviously not defending the French soldiers in these. It's very unusual for me not to be defending La France, and everything, all things French. But nonetheless, one of the cases that you might say total war comes before Napoleon, and this of course is the Vendée, which I alluded to the other day, the Civil War in the West, because there you had cases of them simply razing villages and lining people up against the wall and gunning down priests and drowning nuns, and this sort of extremely asocial, antisocial behavior. But one of the things that, about these civil wars, and the case was true in Spain, is that from the point of view of soldiers, anybody was in a guerrilla war, anyone was a potential assailant. And so again, and this is not excusing what French troops did in the Vendée, but to have made it a big political issue, which people did in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and say it's the first genocide, which is what the far right was saying, the traditional far right, not Le Pen and those folks who would be happy to massacre almost anybody who they didn't view as French. But I mean, it's sheer nonsense. It's simply not the case. So I mean, there are some context that should be provided in thinking about that. But it's an interesting theme, and it's worth discussing. And when you're doing this reading, which I hope you'll do, that's not a bad idea to think about. Okay, let me just make a few points. We have about 10 minutes left, and this is just to amplify what you're reading about. I mean, because anyone who's ever had to wait in line at a prefecture in France for a driver's license, or in our case, our French identity cards, or almost anything else, will be cursing Napoleon for having maintained this sort of centralization that emerged out of absolutism and was honed in defense of the Republic by folks like the Committee of Public Safety, but where Napoleon founded a rational, enlightened way, entre guillemets, in quotes, enlightened way, out of the Enlightenment way of organizing a state. And certainly Napoleon, who, whether he snatched the crown out of the Pope's hand and crowned himself, or let the Pope crown him, is not the issue. I mean, Napoleon could have pretty much done whatever he wanted, but in fact what he does is he maintains the departments, the départements, and the departments created in 1790, they send a prefect who is like the intendant, but even more centralized, the intendant, to each département in 1800. And they keep the same kind of top-down centralized organization. If someone once said that Gaul was divided up into three parts, one thinking about France at the time of Napoleon or any time afterward could think the same thing, that France was divided up into the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of War. And Napoleon, who ruthlessly censored newspapers and forced them out of business and made the costs of their continuation so extremely difficult, while organizing or orchestrating the cult of Napoleon, whether it be through sort of paid artists, some of them extremely great artists, or lesser versions, he maintains the kind of centralization that became important in France and in places where the waves of French troops liberty, fraternity, equality, and all of that, in quotes, ended up. I mean, that maintains, is maintained. He liked to think that the Napoleonic Code was his greatest contribution. He wanted to be the modern Justinian. And in fact, he does oversee lots of the meetings of lawyers and jurists and specialists. And I mean, it's classic, looking back from our view. I mean, it's patently ridiculous that there were many, many more times articles dealing with the sale of cattle than there were of the rights of women. Now, this isn't too surprising because Napoleon, as many dictators, including much more egregious ones, Mussolini and Hitler in the 20th century, viewed women as nothing more than machines for producing babies. And he said this exactly like that. And so, but yet, and I mean, that's a big yet, the Napoleonic Code survives and remains in many cases the basis for the French legal system. And so again, this is an Enlightenment enterprise in many ways gone right. And it is there. Among the other kind of contributions, I mean, we don't have really time to talk about it. It's obvious about this sort of nationalism and that one's value comes from service to the state as opposed from royal blood, though he creates this new nobility based upon service to the state. And the service to the state was above all through the army. So a lot of these people who become marshals and all this, if they were lucky enough to survive all these ridiculous wars, are military types. But the Napoleonic Code and this new sort of service nobility are important things. The Concordat, he does a very important thing, and he makes peace with the Catholic Church. He realized that as long as you had this potential contrast between juring priests and non-juring priests, and that you would still have lots of militant Catholics who wanted some sort of royalist restoration. And indeed, I mean, the king was dead, and his son had died also in prison in Paris. But you've still got the king's brother out there, so it's a very, very shrewd move. Of course, he uses the church for his own propaganda devices, and the church. It continues the tradition of the civil constitution of the French clergy, the relationship between the church and the regime, Napoleonic regime. But this is a very important, clever step that basically ends the turmoil within France, at least to that extent. And the old revolutionary calendar of Germinal and Ventose and Thermidor, I mean, that all disappears and is replaced by the basic calendar. People still, in 1796, 95, in rural France, are not thinking of 10-day units called décadis, something like that. They're thinking of weeks, and they still are having mass said secretly, which was the case in our village even in 1794, until the priest has to go away. But the Concordat, this creation of this peace with the church is obviously a very important thing. And so is really the establishment of the basis of the French educational system that's remained, for better or for worse, the same until today. I'm a big believer in the French educational system. My kids were in French schools for 3 or 4 years, and there's no higher sort of good result of humanity's collective good deeds than a French kindergarten or first or second grade. It begins to fall apart by the time you get to lycée. He created the lycée, the high schools, and then of course the university system is now in total chaos, and Sarkozy will probably make it even worse if he gets his way about creating this sort of American-like hierarchy of institutions, and would really be at the expense of kind of the not the lower level, but the more modest universities in the French system. But be that as it may, Napoleon, it may or may not be true that he once said he could look at his watch and see what everybody is studying at any given moment. And there are lots of problems with the French system. But the division of France into academy, again, this has nothing to do with the academies I've been talking about before, but into as a geographic way of organizing all education from the universities down to kindergarten, or even to crèche, even to nursery schools, organized by region. It has lasted through all this time. I mean, it really is an extraordinary accomplishment. An academy, for example, now would be the Academy of Limoges, or the Academy of Grenoble, and it would, or the Academy of Marseille, or the Academy of Strasbourg, and it covers 2 or 3 or 4, depending on the region, departments. And you know, it's almost impossible to get a school teacher fired, by the way. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, I shouldn't go into, be very indiscreet to go about this, into this too much, but you know, if you try to get a school teacher in a village fired, I mean, you can't, you know, it has to go through the head of the whole academy, who is called the rector, or the rectrice, Madame la rectrice, or Monsieur le recteur. It's very impossible, but there are problems with that. But nonetheless, the reason that, and here I sound like this is a very pro-French thing to say, but the reason that French children, as Finnish children, and as children almost in most European countries, test at a very much higher level than those in the United States, at any level you can imagine, is because they have a centralized education system, which does not believe that you should have, you know, wealthy communes, wealthy parts of France having all of the advantages, and then schools that have very limited financial resources have not the same possibilities for exceptional advancement. And this, I mean, France has the grandes écoles. I mean, the big time, big high-powered elite schools, elite universities. They've got their equivalents of the fancy places, of which you're all in one now. But nonetheless, Napoleon does create a system which is long-lasting and which allowed over time the educational structure of France to advance in very, very meaningful ways in the whole course of the period. So no matter what you think about the fact that he, in the end, he was a megalomaniac and lots of people get killed because of him. There's no doubt about that. But the wave of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period has long-lasting results almost everywhere. To take an example, unification of Italy. Italy will become unified in the 1860s. In early 1870s, unified in quotes. Metternich said it was a geographic expression only, and to an extent he may have been correct. The unification comes through Piedmont, Sardinia, which was the most prosperous part of Italy. It's in the north. They had the benefits of this French bureaucracy, of this administration that was centralized, that allowed them to be more prosperous than other parts of Italy. It contributes to that. They had other advantages too, so the Napoleonic wave did make a difference. Though it's hard to, when you go to Paris, and if you go to the Louvre, it's hard to not think of the fact that many of the treasures that are there were simply looted from Italy. Loaded not in trains as Goering and Goebbels and those folks looted art treasures during World War II, but put very carefully packed on military wagons and returned to Paris. So we can debate about Napoleon and all of that. My view is already probably fairly clear, but one has to admit that besides just the romance of his life and a career open to talent and all of that, that he made a huge difference and thus was worth spending some time on. Have a good weekend. I'm going to St. Louis.